When most people think about Christianity's impact on politics, they imagine moral crusades, religious wars, or the rise of theocracy. But the real transformation runs far deeper than these surface manifestations. Christianity didn't just change what politics discussed. It fundamentally altered the very nature of political experience itself, in ways that even secular minds today cannot escape. What if I told you that the most profound political revolution in Western history wasn't the French Revolution or the American founding, but something that happened much earlier, when a new understanding of human existence began to dissolve the foundations of political life as the ancients knew it? This transformation didn't happen through conquest or legislation, but through a subtle yet radical shift in how human beings understood their relationship to the world, to each other, and to eternity. The story I want to explore with you today reveals how Christianity inadvertently undermined the very possibility of politics in its classical sense, not through hostility to public life, but through something far more fundamental, by relocating the highest human activities from the public realm to the privacy of the soul. This shift created the conditions for both the greatest achievements and the most dangerous pathologies of our modern political existence. Understanding this transformation is crucial for anyone seeking to comprehend why politics today feels so different from what our democratic founders envisioned. Chapter 1: The Ancient Political World That Christianity Encountered. To understand Christianity's revolutionary impact, we must first grasp what politics meant before its arrival. In the ancient world, particularly in Greece and Rome, politics wasn't simply about governing or administering society. It was the realm where human beings achieved their highest possibility, the demonstration of who they were through words and deeds before their equals. The public realm, the residential publica, was literally the thing that belonged to the people collectively. It was a space of appearance where individuals could transcend the mere biological fact of their existence and reveal their unique identity through action. In this realm, immortality wasn't promised by gods, but achieved through memorable words and deeds that would be preserved in the collective memory of the community. Consider what this meant practically. When Pericles delivered his funeral oration, or when Cicero spoke in the Senate, they weren't merely expressing opinions or advocating policies. They were engaged in the fundamental human activity of self-revelation through speech and action. Politics was the space where the particular excellence of each individual could shine forth, creating a web of relationships that constituted the common world. This political realm was carefully distinguished from two other spheres of human activity. The private realm of the household dealt with the necessities of life, reproduction, sustenance, the maintenance of biological existence. The realm of contemplation, whether philosophical or religious, was concerned with eternal truths that transcended the particular and contingent world of human affairs. What made politics unique was its focus on plurality, the fact that we are not just human beings in general, but this particular human being, irreplaceably distinct from every other. Politics was the space where this plurality could appear and be preserved. It required equals who could see and judge each other's actions, creating what I call the space of appearance, where freedom could manifest itself. The Romans added to this Greek inheritance their own genius for founding and preserving institutions. They understood that political life required not just spontaneous action, but durable structures that could outlast individual lives. Their conception of authority, auctoritas, was tied to the act of founding itself, deriving legitimacy not from power or force, but from the sacred moment when the political community was established. This ancient political world possessed something we have largely lost: a clear understanding that politics was not about solving problems or administering things, but about the sheer human capacity to begin something new, to act in concert with others, and to create a lasting common world. It was this understanding that Christianity would unknowingly but fundamentally challenge. Chapter 2: Christianity's unprecedented focus on individual souls. Christianity entered this political world with a revolutionary message that seemed, at first glance, to have little to do with politics. Its central concern was not with the public realm, but with something entirely new: the individual soul and its relationship to eternity. This focus represented an unprecedented development in human consciousness, one whose political implications would only become clear centuries later. The Christian promise was radically different from anything the ancient world had known, where Greeks sought immortality through glorious deeds remembered by their community, and where Romans found continuity through institutions that would outlast them. Christianity offered personal immortality to every individual soul, regardless of their worldly achievements or public status. This was genuinely revolutionary. For the first time in human history, the highest human possibility was located not in the public realm of action and speech, but in the private relationship between the individual soul and God, the most important drama of human existence, salvation or damnation, played out not on the stage of public life, but in the hidden depths of individual conscience and faith. Consider what this meant for human relationships and community. In the ancient world, we became who we were through our interactions with others in the public realm. Our identity was inseparable from how we appeared to our equals, how our words and deeds created lasting relationships and memories. But Christianity suggested that our true self, our soul, existed independently of these worldly relationships and appearances. The Christian emphasis on love fundamentally altered human relationships, where politics required the careful maintenance of distance and respect among equals. Christian love demanded the elimination of the worldly distinctions that made politics possible. In the eyes of God, there were no meaningful differences between slave and free, Greek and barbarian, male and female. This equality before God was beautiful and morally transformative, but it undermined the plurality that was essential to political life. Christianity also introduced an entirely new temporal structure to human experience, where ancient politics was concerned with founding something that would last, creating institutions and memories that could survive individual death. Christianity directed attention toward an eternal realm that transcended all worldly concerns. The kingdom of God was not of this world, and ultimate fulfillment lay not in political achievement, but in otherworldly salvation. The monasteries that emerged in the early Christian centuries represented the logical extension of this new orientation. Here were communities of individuals who had withdrawn from worldly concerns entirely, focusing exclusively on the cultivation of their souls and their relationship with God. While these communities developed their own forms of organization and governance, they explicitly rejected the political concerns that had defined public life in the ancient world. Yet Christianity's challenge to politics was not hostile or intentional. Early Christians weren't trying to destroy political life. They were simply pursuing what they saw as the highest human calling. But by relocating ultimate meaning from the public realm to the private soul, they inevitably diminished the significance and attractiveness of political engagement. Chapter 3: The Dissolution of Public and Private Boundaries. One of Christianity's most profound political effects was its gradual dissolution of the careful boundaries that ancient thought had established between public and private life. This transformation didn't happen overnight, but its consequences continue to shape our political experience today in ways we rarely recognize. Think about your own experience for a moment. When you engage in political discussions or activities, do you clearly distinguish between your private convictions and your public role as a citizen? Most of us today find such a distinction artificial, even hypocritical. We expect authenticity, sincerity, and the integration of personal values with public positions. This expectation, which seems so natural to us, would have been almost incomprehensible to ancient political actors. The ancient distinction between public and private wasn't merely conventional. It was essential to the possibility of politics itself. The private realm dealt with the necessities of life, biological needs, economic requirements, family relationships. These were important, but they were not political because they concerned what was necessary rather than what was possible, what was given rather than what could be created through human action. The public realm, by contrast, was the space of freedom precisely because it was liberated from these necessities. Citizens could engage in politics not because they had to solve problems or meet needs, but because they were free to act, to speak, and to reveal who they were through words and deeds. This freedom required the prior solution of life's necessities in the private realm. Christianity challenged this distinction in multiple ways. First, by insisting that the most important aspect of human existence, the soul's relationship to God, was private and invisible. It elevated the private realm to unprecedented significance. The interior life of conscience, faith, and personal relationship with the divine became more important than any public achievement. Second, Christian love refused to respect the boundaries that made political relationships possible. Where politics required maintaining distance and distinction among citizens, treating others as equals but not as intimates, Christian love demanded the breakdown of such barriers. The command to love one's neighbor as oneself, while morally beautiful, made the careful choreography of political relationships extremely difficult. Third, Christianity introduced into public discourse concerns that had previously belonged to the private realm. Questions of personal morality, individual salvation, and ultimate meaning began to appear as public issues. The boundary between what could appropriately be discussed publicly and what belonged to private life began to blur. The long-term consequences of this blurring are visible throughout modern political life. We routinely expect our political leaders to be personally virtuous, to share their private convictions publicly, and to demonstrate authenticity rather than the kind of role-playing that ancient politics required. We bring private concerns, personal identity, lifestyle choices, individual fulfillment, into the public realm as legitimate political issues. This isn't necessarily wrong, but it represents a fundamental transformation in the nature of political life. When everything becomes political, when there are no clear boundaries between public and private concerns, politics loses its specific character as the realm of action and speech among equals and becomes instead a total way of life that encompasses everything. Understanding this transformation helps explain why contemporary politics often feels so invasive, so totalizing, and so deeply personal in ways that exhaust rather than energize us. Chapter 4. Authority's transformation from foundation to faith. Perhaps nowhere is Christianity's political transformation more evident than in its complete reconceptualization of authority. The Romans had understood authority, auctoritas, as something that derived from the act of founding itself, tied to the sacred moment when the political community was established. Christianity would gradually replace this founding-based authority with something entirely different: authority based on faith, revelation, and divine command. Roman authority was inseparable from the idea of augmentation, literally increasing or adding to something that already existed. When the Senate provided auctoritas to a proposed action, they weren't creating something new, but adding the weight of the founding to present decisions. Authority flowed backward from the founding moment, connecting present actions to the original establishment of the political community. This understanding made authority entirely worldly and political. It didn't depend on personal charisma, divine revelation, or moral superiority. Instead, it derived from institutional position and the capacity to connect present action to the founding tradition. Authority was impersonal in the best sense. It belonged to offices and institutions rather than to individuals, and it could be exercised by anyone who properly occupied the relevant position. Christianity introduced a radically different conception: Divine authority flowed not from earthly founding, but from God Himself, mediated through revelation, scripture, and ecclesiastical hierarchy. This authority was personal. It depended on faith, grace, and spiritual insight rather than institutional position. It was also absolute in a way that political authority could never be, since it derived from the source of all existence. The gradual Christianization of the Roman Empire created a fascinating hybrid. Political institutions remained, but their ultimate justification increasingly derived from Christian sources. The emperor ruled not just by virtue of his connection to Rome's founding, but by divine right. Laws gained legitimacy not just from their connection to founding principles, but from their conformity to divine will. This transformation had profound consequences for political life. When authority becomes absolute and derives from sources beyond the political realm, it can no longer be questioned, debated, or modified through political action. The kind of ongoing conversation among equals that characterized ancient politics becomes impossible when some participants claim access to absolute truth through revelation. Consider how this affects our contemporary political experience. We routinely encounter political arguments that claim absolute moral authority. Positions presented not as matters for political debate among equals, but as moral imperatives that brook no disagreement. Whether these arguments come from religious or secular sources, they share the structure of Christian authority. They claim access to truth that transcends political discussion. The result is a peculiar situation where political debates become impossible precisely because the stakes seem too high. If we're arguing about absolute moral truth rather than about prudent action in particular circumstances, then compromise becomes betrayal and opposition becomes evil. Politics requires the ability to distinguish between what is important and what is essential, between what we prefer and what we absolutely cannot accept. Christianity's gift of absolute moral standards has enriched human civilization in countless ways, but it has also made the kind of political argument that democracy requires extraordinarily difficult. When every political question becomes a question of ultimate meaning, politics itself becomes impossible. The challenge for those of us who want to preserve political life is learning to distinguish between those areas where absolute moral standards appropriately apply and those areas where political judgment, prudence, and compromise are not only acceptable but necessary. Chapter 5: The Birth of the Social and Its Political Consequences. Christianity's emphasis on love and charity inadvertently gave birth to an entirely new realm of human experience that the ancients had never recognized, what we now call the social. This development would prove to be one of the most consequential political transformations in Western history, creating conditions that make authentic political life increasingly difficult. Take a moment to consider how naturally you think about social issues, social problems, social justice. These concepts seem obviously important to us, but they would have been nearly incomprehensible to ancient political actors. They didn't think in terms of society as a realm of human experience distinct from both private household concerns and public political life. The emergence of the social represents a genuine innovation in human consciousness, one that Christianity made possible. Christian charity demanded attention to human suffering and need in ways that ancient politics had explicitly excluded from public concern. The poor, the sick, the outcast, those whom ancient politics relegated to the private realm of biological necessity, became objects of Christian love and, eventually, public concern. This was morally transformative and represents one of Christianity's greatest contributions to human civilization. But this development also created unprecedented political problems. Ancient politics had been possible precisely because it was liberated from the realm of necessity, from biological needs, economic requirements, and material concerns. Citizens could engage in political action because their basic needs were met privately. leaving them free to pursue the higher activities of speech and action in the public realm. Christianity's emphasis on charity gradually brought these concerns of necessity into public view. What had been private problems, poverty, illness, material want, became public issues requiring collective response. This wasn't wrong, but it fundamentally altered the character of public life. Instead of being a realm of freedom and action, the public realm increasingly became a realm of problem-solving and administration. The emergence of the social created a new kind of human experience, mass society, when our primary relationship to others is not as political equals engaged in action and speech, but as fellow sufferers requiring care and assistance. We begin to relate to each other as members of a mass rather than as distinct individuals. The plurality that was essential to political life gives way to the uniformity of shared need and shared vulnerability. This transformation helps explain why modern politics so often feels like administration rather than action. We focus on managing problems, distributing resources, and coordinating responses to social needs. These are important activities, but they aren't political in the classical sense because they don't create space for individuals to reveal who they are through words and deeds. The social realm operates according to different principles than either private life or political life. Private life is governed by necessity and intimacy, political life by freedom and plurality, but social life is governed by conformity and behavioral predictability. In the social realm, we're expected to behave in certain ways, to follow established patterns, to suppress the kind of spontaneous action that characterized ancient politics. Consider how this affects contemporary political movements. Even movements that begin with genuine political aspirations, the desire to act together to create something new, quickly become social movements focused on solving problems, meeting needs, and administrating solutions. The initial spark of political action gets channeled into the machinery of social management. This isn't inevitable, but it's extremely difficult to resist because the social realm's problems are real and urgent. Human suffering demands response. But when all public energy gets absorbed into social concerns, the space for genuine political action, for beginning something new, for revealing human plurality, for creating lasting institutions, gradually disappears. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for anyone who wants to preserve possibilities for authentic political life in the modern world. Chapter 6: Judgment, Conscience, and the Loss of Political Taste. One of Christianity's most subtle but profound effects on politics was its transformation of human judgment from a public, political faculty into a private, moral one. This shift from political judgment to moral conscience has created lasting difficulties for democratic life that we struggle with even today. In the ancient world, judgment was fundamentally a public activity. Citizens developed what we might call political taste, the ability to discriminate between better and worse courses of action, to recognize excellence in speech and deed, to appreciate the appropriateness of particular responses to particular situations. This judgment was cultivated through participation in public life, through seeing and being seen by others, through the ongoing conversation that constituted political community. Political judgment was not about applying universal moral principles to particular cases. Instead, it was the capacity to navigate particular situations without predetermined rules, to recognize what was fitting in specific circumstances, to appreciate the unique qualities that each person brought to public life. It was more like aesthetic judgment than moral reasoning, concerned with what was beautiful, appropriate, and excellent rather than with what was universally right or wrong. Christianity introduced an entirely different kind of judgment, the examination of conscience. This was a private activity, conducted in solitude, focused on the conformity of one's actions and intentions to divine commandments or moral principles. Conscience was concerned with the universal rather than the particular. with eternal standards rather than worldly appropriateness. The Christian emphasis on conscience was morally revolutionary. It made possible unprecedented levels of self-examination and moral sensitivity. It created space for individual resistance to corrupt or evil authority. The idea that each person has direct access to moral truth through conscience has been one of the foundations of human dignity and individual rights. But the transformation of judgment from a public, political faculty into a private, moral one has also created serious problems for political life. When citizens approach political questions primarily through moral conscience rather than political judgment, they tend to apply universal principles rather than considering particular circumstances. They become more concerned with being morally pure than with finding workable solutions to common problems. Consider how this affects contemporary political discourse. We routinely encounter citizens who approach political questions by asking, "What do my moral principles require?" rather than, "What kind of action would be appropriate and effective in these particular circumstances?" The first question leads to positions that are morally satisfying, but often politically impractical. The second question requires the kind of political judgment that can only be developed through engagement with others in public life. The privatization of judgment has also made it extremely difficult to develop shared standards for evaluating political action. When judgment becomes a matter of individual conscience, there's no way to argue about or develop collective standards for political excellence. Each person's moral convictions become equally valid, making public deliberation about the quality of political action nearly impossible. This creates what I call the loss of political taste, the inability to distinguish between better and worse forms of political action based on anything other than moral agreement or personal preference. We can judge politicians based on whether we agree with their positions or like their personalities. But we have difficulty developing shared criteria for political excellence that could guide our choices as citizens. The recovery of political judgment requires learning to think politically rather than morally about political questions, to consider not just what is right in principle, but what is possible and appropriate in particular circumstances. This doesn't mean abandoning moral standards, but it does mean recognizing that political action requires a different kind of judgment than moral reasoning. Developing this capacity requires active engagement in public life, exposure to different perspectives, and the cultivation of what the ancients called phronesis, practical wisdom that can navigate particular situations without predetermined rules. Chapter 7: Rediscovering Political Life in a Post-Christian World. The question that emerges from this analysis is both urgent and difficult. How can we rediscover authentic political life in a world that has been fundamentally shaped by Christianity's transformation of human consciousness? This isn't a matter of returning to some pre-Christian past. That's neither possible nor desirable, but of learning to distinguish between what Christianity legitimately offers human life and what it inadvertently threatens in political existence. The first step is recognizing that we live in multiple realms simultaneously, each with its own appropriate concerns and standards. The private realm of intimate relationships, personal faith, and individual development deserves the protection and cultivation that Christianity helped make possible. The realm of social concern, caring for human need, addressing suffering, pursuing justice, requires the moral sensitivity that Christian love has nurtured. But we must also preserve space for a distinctly political realm where different standards apply. Political life requires plurality, not just the abstract idea of diversity, but the concrete reality of different people with different perspectives acting together despite their differences. This plurality is threatened whenever we try to impose uniform standards, whether those standards derive from religious conviction, moral principle, or ideological commitment. Politics needs citizens who can appreciate difference without trying to eliminate it. Consider what this means practically. In our personal lives, We appropriately seek relationships with people who share our deepest values and convictions. In our social concern for justice and human welfare, we rightfully advocate for principles we believe are universally valid. But in political life, we must learn to act with people whose deepest convictions differ from ours. Not despite these differences, but because of them. Political action requires this plurality. The recovery of political life also requires rediscovering the capacity for judgment that can navigate particular situations without predetermined rules. This means learning to ask political questions. What kind of action is appropriate in these circumstances? What are the likely consequences of different approaches? How can we create durable institutions that will serve future generations? These are different from moral questions about what universal principles require or social questions about how to solve human problems. We must also recover appreciation for political founding and institution building. One of the most remarkable aspects of the American experience was the founders' recognition that political communities required deliberate creation and careful maintenance. They understood that political life doesn't happen automatically, but must be consciously founded and continually renewed. This requires what I call political natality, the human capacity to begin something new, to take initiative, to break cycles of predictable behavior and response. Every genuine political action creates something unprecedented, adds something new to the world, opens possibilities that didn't exist before. This capacity for beginning is perhaps the most distinctly human political ability. But political natality can't be exercised in isolation. It requires what the ancients called power, not power over others, but power that emerges when people act together. This kind of power appears whenever citizens gather to address common concerns, and it disappears whenever people retreat into privacy or try to solve political problems through force or manipulation. The challenge for contemporary citizens is learning to create and preserve spaces where this kind of political power can appear. This might involve neighborhood organizations, civic associations, local political groups, or new forms of public engagement that haven't yet been invented. What matters is not the specific form, but the commitment to acting with others in ways that preserve plurality while creating common purposes. Most importantly, we must resist the temptation to solve political problems through non-political means, whether through technical expertise, moral persuasion, or administrative efficiency. Politics has its own integrity and its own standards of excellence. Learning to respect and cultivate these standards is essential for preserving the possibility of free political life. Conclusion: Christianity's transformation of politics represents one of the most profound and least understood revolutions in human history. By redirecting human attention from the public realm to the private soul, from temporal action to eternal salvation, from political plurality to spiritual unity, Christianity inadvertently undermined the very foundations of political life as the ancients understood it. This wasn't malicious or intentional. Christianity offered humanity unprecedented insights into individual dignity, moral responsibility, and spiritual possibility. Its emphasis on love, charity, and the infinite worth of every soul has enriched human civilization beyond measure. But these very gifts created new challenges for political existence that we're still learning to navigate. The emergence of the social realm, the privatization of judgment, the transformation of authority from founding-based to faith-based, the dissolution of public-private boundaries. All of these developments have made authentic political life more difficult, even as they've opened new possibilities for individual fulfillment and moral development. Understanding this transformation isn't about rejecting Christianity's contributions, but about learning to preserve space for distinctly political activities and relationships. We need the moral sensitivity that Christianity has cultivated, the social concern it has fostered, and the respect for individual dignity it has championed. But we also need the political capacity for action, judgment, and institution building that enables free people to create and maintain common worlds. The task for citizens today is learning to live simultaneously in multiple realms, private, social, and political, without collapsing the distinctions that make each realm valuable. This requires both the wisdom to recognize what each realm appropriately offers and the judgment to know when we're confusing the standards that apply to different aspects of human experience. Our capacity for political life depends on this kind of discriminating judgment.